In this lesson, we're going to prepare the final production render by increasing our settings. Now, I had gone and tweaked the lighting a little bit more since the end of the last lesson. I'd basically tried to turn the sun. If I just have a look in top view, I had turned the sun to this position from where it was originally. And I tried to achieve a sunset effect by lowering the angle of the sun. So if I look in elevation, you can see the sun is much lower than the one that we had before. And in order for me to compensate for the lower sun, in other words, when you drop a V-Ray sun slightly lower, it's going to decrease in intensity. So I had to compensate by increasing the intensity multiplier from 0.05, I think it was, to 0.3. So that is quite a big increase for a V-Ray sun. And then I had also gone and changed the shutter speed from 12 to 8. So this allowed me to get even more light because I was now receiving a lot less light from this lower sun in the new position. And the result of that is something that I can show you here. I've done a test render, and this is more or less the lighting that we get. So if we compare it to what it was like before, at the end of the last lesson we had rendered this, and now with the new sun position we're getting something like this. So what I do like about it is with a lower sun you're getting much warmer colors, which I think looks quite good in contrast to the blue, so that you're getting more range in your actual color scheme. What I do like though about this one in contrast is that the sharper shadows that you have do work quite well with the house, because you have these 45-degree angles and you have also this sharp angle of shadow. It does work quite well, although I'm going to carry on using this one, which is a little bit more in the spirit of the type of renders that I like to do, that have very warm and gentle light. These are the type of things that people feel quite attracted to because they can imagine themselves sitting here sipping a cocktail in the sunset, and that's the lifestyle that they want to live, even though this looks a little bit more dramatic and edgy. So this is the one that we're going to go for. So now let's have a look at that camera view, and let's bring up our render settings, and we're going to increase these slightly until we can get a production image ready that we're then going to export into Photoshop. So the first thing you want to do is to increase your image size, and we're starting right now under the common tab under common properties. And what you want to first of all figure out, and I did mention this earlier on in the course, is find out what your image aspect ratio should be. This will be generally driven by the clients themselves telling you that we're printing something for, let's say, an A2 printout or an A1 printout. Perhaps it's going onto a website and you need to have a particular aspect ratio. You want to make sure that they don't get your image and then need to crop it down, meaning that they will actually distort your entire perspective that you have taken so long to set up. So for example, I am going to be using this image as a thumbnail for digital tutors for you to find the course, and they use an image aspect ratio of 2, in other words, double the width to the height. So this can now be increased. I'm not going to make it too large for our case. I will use a figure of 3000, and just keep in mind that you can lock your aspect ratio using that button. So this is quite important to get right from the beginning. Next, we're going to go to our V-Ray tab, and over here we can make sure that our filtering is on. If you have a lot of glass, or if you have many images of trees that have opacity in, just make sure that your opacity or your transparency levels are high enough for you to not have any trees render black. So keep this number high. Don't drop it down to 2 or 1 just because you think that you have one layer of glass in your scene. Next, we want to go down to anti-aliasing. You can choose to turn it on. You can have a look at a few other tutorials if you want to go into much more detail on different effects that anti-aliasing filters give. This tutorial is mainly a modeling tutorial and a workflow tutorial, so I'm not going to go in any detail about these very high render settings and fine differences between each and every button in this setting. So I'm just going to fly through some of the settings that I use. In most of my production renders, believe it or not, I don't even use anti-aliasing. I rather increase my image size and decrease my noise. Then in the image that we're going to work with, we don't have HDRI turned on. We can obviously have a look at what it would look like if it is turned on, but that is a issue that can be dealt with in the previous lesson where we dealt with HDRIs and those settings. So next we're going to go to the indirect illumination tab. So this is the area where you start to make more of your changes. So here you can open up your irradiance map. Your preset, if you do want to work it this way, you can just increase it to high or medium. If you're doing an animation, then of course choose the medium animation setting. And for our case, I'm going to use medium. In most cases, that will be more than good enough for an average client, unless it's going onto television or large media. Then you really want to go and have a much higher setting. Then the one figure or the one number that I like to change if need be is the interpolated samples. If you do notice that light is a little bit spotty, then you can increase this amount and it'll actually blur out your light when the photons, or at least when the light particles, hit the surfaces. Next, as we scroll down, we can open up the light cache. We can increase the subdivisions to 1000. Then we can make the sample size smaller, so let's use 0.01. Next, we're going to go to the filter and we're going to choose nearest. And we can also include a pre-filter. Then everything on this page you can leave as is. In your settings, you can decrease the number for your noise threshold. Generally, you don't have to go too low if your light and everything else, if your other settings are fine. Very often what happens is that people have quite high, or rather low subdivisions, and they have quite high grain in their images, and they try to compensate through the noise threshold. All you need to do is to have a look at your materials that are producing noise. For example, I already mentioned the frame material having a low number for the reflective glossiness. I've had to go and manually go and increase the subdivision value so that I don't have so much noise. So instead of affecting your noise threshold here, which will greatly increase your render times, rather go material by material and just see where those culprits are locally and increase your subdivisions for those materials, instead of doing it with the sledgehammer approach by just increasing the noise calculation. So the last one you can increase if need be is your global subdivision multiplier. In most cases I leave it at 1. I very rarely need to touch it because this is another figure that greatly increases render time, which I'm not a great fan of. So just about once you finish that list, you can lastly go to your render elements, and this is again something that I don't really make use of, but I do notice that a lot of studios like using it, and you will be able to add several types of render elements. The ones that are really helpful is V-Ray Alpha, which you can get if you just save a PNG with the alpha turned on. The second one, which is quite helpful, is the material ID. Various architecture firms, interior design firms, they like to have material IDs on so that they can locally change certain objects within your scene. So this will render a solid render with multiple color patches for different IDs that you manually go and input. So it's not really my task right now to go and explain what all of these are. You can have a look at that on the side. I'm just pointing it out as I'm going through this list so that you know that it's there and you know that you have access to it. So I'm going to now press pause and render the image, and let's just have a look at what the result is, and let's see whether that is good enough. So here's our completed render, and I'm just going to zoom in and we're just going to have a look at a few things that you could still iron out if you wanted to go for a much higher quality. So the first thing to notice is the frames that are still giving you a little bit of noise in these areas. So this can be dealt with using the subdivisions of the actual material, and if all of that is still not enough, then you can look at your noise threshold in the render settings. So that is something that we had already looked at. So that noise can be seen in these panels as well. So all of these elements have quite a low level of reflection. So let me just open up those materials, and you can see that where all those materials, just like the frames, have a reflection which has got a low number of glossiness, then those are the areas that you want to essentially be careful of. So besides that, in terms of color, we have quite decent lighting where we don't have shadows that are too dark. So over here we can see more or less the difference between the brightest and the darkest areas next to each other. So this is a good gauge to see that you're not over brightening your scene. In other words, here I'm still seeing some of the detail on the walls, I'm seeing some of the light shadows and the actual texture. If the sun was too bright, then all of this would have just been a solid color. So that's something you want to watch out for. Next, you can also look at your shadows. If you see that there is a lot of grain in your shadow, you can go across to your sun. And I'm just going to quickly point that out to you, that you have the shadow subdivisions as 3 at the moment, which can give you quite a grainy effect. So you can also increase that subdivision amount to get smoother, more blurry shadows. So besides all of that, we're going to do the rest of the touch-ups in Photoshop, and we're going to have a look at how some of these darker areas can just be brightened and brushed out using a couple of Photoshop brushes, and we'll then add the final sky. So a few more things that I just wanted to mention before finishing this lesson. First of all, when you save your image, choose to save it as a PNG, and that will allow you to save the alpha channel. So if you type 6 or any number or any name.png, just make sure that your alpha channel is turned on. So besides that, the last thing that I wanted to show you is in our render when we are in our camera view, what we're going to render separately is the actual planting that we have in the background. So you can go to your references and then to XREF Scene, and you can just turn on that tree background layer and you can turn off the foreground layer, and then this can be rendered out separately. So that's what we're going to have a look at in Photoshop in the next lesson, so join me for that.